Good afternoon. Today we're in Psalm chapter 70. It's a very short psalm. He begins by saying in verse number 1, "Make haste, O God, deliver me, make haste to help me, O Lord. Let them be ashamed and confounded that seek after my life or soul. Let them be turned back and put to confusion that the desire to be hurt. Let them be turned back for a reward of their shame that say, Ha ha." Verse number 4, "Let them that seek thee rejoice and be glad in thee, and let such as love thy salvation say continually, Let God be magnified. But I am poor," in verse number 5, "and needy. Make haste to me, O God. Thou art my help and my deliverance. O Lord, make no tarrying." If you noticed in the reading of this verse that David mentions 4 times for God to make haste or to answer his prayer quickly. In verse number 1, he mentions it 2 times. In verse number 4, he mentions to make haste again. And then in verse number 5, he asks God not to tarry in his answer. So David is asking God to answer his prayer shortly, that is, very quickly. And it's interesting, I think, excuse me, because got something there tickling my throat, excuse me again. But in verse number, or rather in Matthew chapter 6 and verse number 7, you recall that Jesus was telling us not to pray like the Pharisees, because they would stand in the streets and the corners of the streets, and they wanted to be seen as pious men. And one of the avenues by which they did that was their prayer. And so he says in verse number 7, "But when you pray, use not empty or vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they shall be heard from their much speaking." What's interesting, I think, in this psalm is that it's a very quick prayer. And of course, obviously, David is in some kind of desperate situation. Sometimes, you can wait for a long time for an answer in prayer, but sometimes you need God to answer quickly because you're in such a desperate situation, such a near death or some kind of calamity, that if God doesn't act quickly, you're not going to get out of it. I remember when Peter was out there on the sea, and Jesus came by walking on the water, and Peter went out there, you see, at the invitation of Jesus, and when he took his eyes off the Lord, he began to sink, and he said, "Lord, help me." He needed a quick answer. And so it's interesting, I think, that sometimes you see a short prayer can be just as effective as a long prayer. What's really important is that in that faith that you have in God, that you need God to answer you quickly. So I want to leave you with this impression today that sometimes a short prayer can be very effective, especially when you need immediate help. And that's what David is saying. Now, one other thought in the psalm, because you see this so oftentimes, and you might see it as repetitious or redundant, you need to remember that in the Psalms, it's over a lifetime of prayer. And so when we're reading one psalm after another, you might be thinking that David's praying these kind of prayers every day, but he wasn't. But there were occasions in his life, and here a desperate situation where he needed God to answer. Now, when he talks about the enemies, as we read there about turning them back, and you'll see a lot of this in David's psalm, it's not that he wanted vengeance. That's what we want sometimes, but it's the idea is that he wants justice. We don't live in a fair world. There's a lot of injustice that goes on. And what David really wants is justice. Wouldn't it be great? I mean, wouldn't it be something else if we lived in a fair world? Because all of us in some time or another have been treated unfairly, and we cry out for justice. We want fairness, especially if we're the recipient of injustice. So that's what David is saying. When he does talk about God taking care of the enemies, he wants justice. And by the way, he always wants God to handle that, and we need to remember. But so there's the prayer today. It's a short one. It's a short prayer. Sometimes you probably think the preacher ought to have a short sermon. It might be just as effective as a long one. But short prayers sometimes can be very effective, and God does answer quickly sometimes or prayers. So that's the thought today, and I hope that you're staying with me through the Psalms, because we're learning so much as we continue our study in the Psalms. And I'll be seeing you again on Monday, and hope to see you this Lord's Day as we worship together in Columbiana.